In the United States, there are about 3.5 million children who were brought into this country illegally by their parents. These children have now grown up here. They've gone to our schools, some of them have gone through our colleges, they've gotten jobs, some of them have joined the military. This is the only country that they've known, many of them. This is the only country they've known. And now they're adults. And yet, they're still here illegally. We call them dreamers because they dream that someday they'll be able to get some kind of legal status here in the United States, maybe become citizens in the United States. Now the problem is, if they get that status, then will that encourage other people to come here illegally? And so this dilemma continues for our country, and it continues for many countries. They're all wrestling with this issue of who can be included and who should be excluded. Who's included? Who's excluded? That question is at the center of the book of Ruth. Now, last week, you may have heard a sermon about the beginning of this story about Ruth. It begins with a tragedy. It begins with a family that lives in Bethlehem in the land of Israel, and Bethlehem is having a famine. The family is starving to death. They have no choice. They have to immigrate. And they immigrate to the country next door. They immigrate to Moab, which they probably don't want to go to because Israelites don't like Moabites. But as soon as they get there, another tragedy happens. The father dies. Now, fortunately, the two sons, Mahlon and Chilion, they're old enough that they can get married, and so they marry Moabite women, Ruth and Orpah. But then another tragedy happens. Mahlon and Chilion die. And so now you've got a family of desperate women. You've got Naomi, the mother, and you've got Ruth and Orpah, the two daughters-in-law. Naomi hears that back in Bethlehem, the famine is over. So she's going to go back to Bethlehem. And Orpah and Ruth, they begin to go with her because they love her. They're attracted to her kindness, and so they want to go with her back to Bethlehem. Naomi has to turn around and say to them, don't come with me. There's no future if you come with me. You have no obligation to me. My sons are dead, and I'm too old to have more sons. You're not going to marry further sons that I have. There's no future if you come with me. And Orpah sensibly decides to turn around and go back to her own home in Moab. But Ruth insists on going with Naomi. Ruth says, where you go, I'll go. Your country will be my country. Your God will be my God. Her intense loyalty to Naomi overrides sensibility. And Naomi gives in. And so Ruth and Naomi head back into Bethlehem. When Naomi arrives, the women of the town, they say, oh, look, Naomi's back. And Naomi says, don't call me Naomi. Naomi means pleasant. Call me Mara. Mara means bitter. Because the Lord has dealt bitterly with me. I left here full and I've been sent back empty. Well, it's the harvest time there in Bethlehem. The barley is ripe and harvesters are out and they're harvesting the fields. And so Naomi says to Ruth, Ruth, why don't you find a field where the harvesters are working, and why don't you follow them and pick up the extra barley that they've left behind. Because you see, in ancient Israel, that's how the poor, that's how widows survived. They had to pick up the leftovers in the fields. And so Ruth goes into a field one day where there's harvesters, and she begins gleaning the leftovers. Now, the field happens to belong to a man named Boaz, and Boaz happens to be Naomi's close relative. Boaz, he sees this foreign woman working in the field, and he goes over to his foreman and he says, "Who's that foreigner over there?" And the foreman says, "Oh, that's a Moabite. Her name's Ruth. She's the one that came back with Naomi. And she's been working hard. She's been working all morning and hasn't taken a break." And Boaz goes over to Ruth and he says to her, "You keep working in my field. In fact, I'm going to tell my harvesters that they shouldn't molest you, don't bother you, and that they should give you water when you need water." And Ruth falls down on her knees and says, "Why are you being so kind to me, a foreigner?" And Boaz says, "Because I've heard about you. I've heard about your loyalty to Naomi. You know, you could have stayed back in your own country, but you stuck with Naomi. So may the Lord do good for you." At lunchtime, Boaz invites Ruth to join the harvesters for lunch. He gives her bread and wine. And he also pulls aside the foreman and says to him, "Now, when you're harvesting, why don't you go ahead and pull some of the grain out of the bundles and leave that behind for her too." So at the end of the day, when Ruth goes back to her mother-in-law Naomi, she's got an enormous amount of grain. And Naomi says, "Where in the world have you been gleaning?" And Ruth says, "Well, in a field belonging to a man named Boaz." Naomi says, "Boaz? Boaz, he's one of my nearest kin. You keep working in his fields." And so Naomi does. She works in Boaz's fields all the way through the harvest season until there's nothing left to harvest, which is a dilemma, because how are Naomi and Ruth going to survive now when there's no more grain? So Naomi comes up with a scheme for how she's going to get Boaz and Ruth together. She says to Ruth, "All right, here's what I want you to do. Boaz is winnowing the grain at the threshing floor, and he sleeps there at night. So what I want you to do is I want you to get all washed up and wear your best clothes, and then tonight when it's dark and no one can see you, you sneak over there to the threshing floor, and then you wait until Boaz goes to bed and he's asleep, and then you creep over there and you uncover his feet and you lie down next to him, and then you do whatever he tells you to do." Well, Ruth follows these instructions. And about midnight, Boaz wakes up, sees this young woman, and says, "What are you doing here? Who are you?" And she says, "I'm Ruth. I am your next of kin through my mother-in-law Naomi. And I am calling on you as my next of kin. I'm calling on you to redeem me, to marry me, so that you can provide for me and for Naomi." Boaz says to her, "This act of loyalty of yours is even greater than the act of loyalty you did for Naomi. You could have gone after the young men, but you have chosen me. Now, it is true, I am a close kin to Naomi, but I'm not the closest kin. So actually, I don't have the first right for marrying you. But tell you what, in the morning, I'm going to find that next of kin, and I'm going to see whether he's willing to give up his right to marry you. And if he does, then I'll marry you." The next morning, Boaz does as he says. He finds that next of kin. They talk it over. The next of kin agrees that if he were to marry Ruth, this would kind of mess up his inheritance that he's planning to give to his own children. And so he gives Boaz permission to take that role as next of kin. And so Boaz marries Ruth. And as it says in the story, the Lord made her conceive, and she bore a son. And the women of the town, they bless Naomi, and they say to her, God has blessed you. God has filled you. You have now a grandson who will provide for you in your old age. And God has given you a daughter-in-law who loves you and who is better than 7 sons. So that's the story. And it is a heartwarming story of how love and loyalty overcomes tragedy and despair. But there's more to the story than that. There is a punchline to this story. Let me read the punchline to you. It's verse 17 in chapter 4. The women of the neighborhood gave him, the son that's been born to Ruth, gave him a name, saying, a son has been born to Naomi. They named him Obed. He became the father of Jesse, the father of David. So, in other words, Ruth is the great-grandmother of David, King David, the most famous king of Israel. Now, what makes this such a punchline, what makes this so shocking, is that Moabites aren't supposed to be able to become Israelites. And Ruth is a Moabite. And descendants of Moabites aren't supposed to become Israelites. And David is partly Moabite. There's a law against Moabites ever becoming Israelites. In Deuteronomy 23, verse 3, it says this, no Ammonite or Moabite shall be admitted to the assembly of the Lord, even to the 10th generation. None of their descendants shall be admitted to the assembly of the Lord. So here's a story that is contradicting one of the laws of Deuteronomy. And the narrator of this story is quite aware of this contradiction. In fact, he plays up the contradiction because throughout the story, he keeps calling Ruth the Moabite. He doesn't just call her the Moabite once, doesn't just call her the Moabite twice, he calls her the Moabite 6 times. The Moabite, the Moabite, the Moabite, the Moabite, the Moabite, the Moabite. You know, once or twice would have been enough. Why does the narrator keep hammering us with this fact that Ruth is a Moabite? Because the narrator is quite aware that this is violating one of the laws of Israel. So how is it that Ruth and her great-grandson, David, can be Israelites? How could that be? It's because of Ruth's loyalty, her faithful love. The Hebrew word that's used here throughout the story of Ruth is chesed. Chesed is probably the most important word in the Hebrew language. Chesed means steadfast love, loyal love, faithful love, constant love. It is this loyal love that overrides the law of Deuteronomy. It is loyal love that overrides the commandment of God, because loyal love is the ultimate law of God. And it is love that determines who's included.